So, today we'll be taking a closer look at blood and the lymphatic system. So, blood may seem just like a plain red liquid, but it actually is a complex tissue that has several parts. Blood is made up of many different components, and it's responsible for transporting materials throughout the body, such as food, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. The different components of blood include plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Around 45% of the volume of blood is cells. The rest is plasma. Let's take a closer look. Red blood cells are the disc-shaped cells that actually carry oxygen to cells and carbon dioxide out of cells into the lungs for exhalation. White blood cells are cells that engulf and digest bacteria and fungi. White blood cells are a very important part of the body's defense system. And lastly, we have plasma, which is the straw-colored liquid component of blood. It is mostly water but contains proteins, glucose, clotting factors, minerals, hormones, and carbon dioxide. So plasma is the only actual liquid component of blood. The rest of blood is made up of cells. Those cells are red blood cells and white blood cells. So plasma. So the majority of blood seems to be plasma, and so materials are transported by blood that are travel in plasma. For example, glucose, carbon dioxide, fats, vitamins, minerals, hormones, which trigger other reactions in the body. And so plasma is mostly made of water. It's about 90% water, and the other 10% is composed of dissolved materials and substances. And so the image on the right is what a blood sample looks like after it's been spun down in a machine. It separates into 3 different layers based off of density. So the red blood cells are going to be the most dense. Then that middle layer is just of white blood cells and platelets, about 1%, and plasma makes up the majority of blood at about 55% of its volume. So there are 3 different types of proteins in plasma, which is what gives plasma its yellow color. So the 3 groups of plasma and proteins include albumins, which help to regulate the amount of water in blood, maintaining blood volume and blood pressure. A second type are globulins. Different types of globulins transport lipids and vitamins. Others help to fight disease. So some proteins in plasma are actually involved in the immune system and the immune response. And then fibrinogen, this is a type of protein that helps to form blood clots. So it's also involved in our immune response. Now let's take a look at platelets. So platelets help the blood to clot. They're actually fragments of cells. They're little bits and pieces. And when a blood vessel is cut, platelets collect and stick to the vessel at the site of your wound. So for example, when you're riding your bike, you fall over, you scrape your knee. Before a scab starts forming, the blood actually coagulates. So it clots. It stops becoming as it's becoming less liquidy and more jelly-like, and eventually hardening into a scab. And so the way platelets work is they actually release a chemical that triggers the production of fibrin. And remember, fibrin is a type of protein that's in the plasma. And so once fibrin is triggered to produce, it makes a tiny net of fibers that go across the blood vessel, trapping red blood cells. So as more and more red blood cells flow along the wounded vessel, they all stop and get collected at the net, forming a giant roadblock or a blood clot. So the next type of cells present in blood are white blood cells. And so white blood cells are mostly involved in the immune system. White blood cells are produced in bone marrow. Their main function is to guard against infection. They fight parasites, attack bacteria, basically any foreign materials in our body. And when I say a foreign material, I mean some type of substance that our body doesn't recognize, that our body is perceiving as being potentially pathogenic. And remember, a pathogen is a disease-causing agent in the body. So, for example, not all bacteria are pathogenic. There are some bacteria which are good that are found in our guts that help us digest food, but then there are also pathogenic bacteria that can make us sick. And so white blood cells produce antibodies. And so antibodies fight off a pathogen. And then once an antibody is made, our white blood cells now know how to make that antibody. And so if that pathogen ever wants to come back and invade our bodies again, our immune system already has a memory of that pathogen and can send out antibodies to attack and destroy it. And so we often call that foreign particle or material that triggers the production of antibodies an antigen. So an antigen could be a virus or bacteria that are coming into the body. The body is going to detect an invader, something that doesn't belong in the body, triggering the body to produce antibodies. And so antibodies and antigens work by recognizing the shape of the structure of the antigen. And so once these antibodies recognize the antigens, they're destroyed. There are also another type of white blood cell. These are called phagocytes. And phagocytes are a type of cell that protects the body by eating foreign substances such as bacteria. So essentially, the cell can just come around and completely engulf what the cellmate feeds. It might seem like a food particle to the cell. It might recognize it as being harmful, and it basically surrounds it, takes it into the cell, digests the bacteria, and then this prevents the spread of infection throughout the body. And so other white blood cells are called lymphocytes, and lymphocytes are white blood cells that actually produce antibodies fighting off the disease. So here we have an example of white blood cells either being phagocytes, meaning they come and they pretty much eat and swallow either the bacteria or viral particle and digest it, or they might produce antibodies, and antibodies help to recognize the cell surface of a harmful body invader. Finally, red blood cells. So red blood cells are the cells that are responsible for delivering oxygen from our lungs to the rest of our body. And so red blood cells are also produced in bone marrow. Red blood cells tend to look like discs with pinched centers. This allows them to bend and twist easily so they can squeeze through narrow spaces such as capillaries. And so bone marrow actually makes red blood cells, platelets, and white blood cells. And so red blood cells get their color from a molecule called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has iron on it. So basically, if you can think of a protein with an iron molecule attached, this protein, hemoglobin, binds to oxygen molecules. So hemoglobin is present in red blood cells. And so when hemoglobin comes in contact with oxygen, the cells become bright red. Without oxygen, the cells are dark red. So that means blood that's leaving the lungs tends to be bright red, And then cell that's traveling in veins back to the heart is usually dark red. So hemoglobin picks up oxygen at the lungs and releases it as blood travels through capillaries throughout the rest of the body. Hemoglobin picks up some of the carbon dioxide produced by cells. Plasma carries away most of the carbon dioxide. Blood carries carbon dioxide back to the lungs where it is released out of the body. And red blood cells lack a nuclei, and so without a nucleus, they can't repair itself or reproduce. So red blood cells only live about 120 days, and our body is constantly reproducing them.